Plato, it seems, once said, "The highest form of knowledge is empathy, for it requires us to suspend our egos and live in another's world. It requires profound purpose larger than the self." Stop quote. Welcome to podcast Pratidhwani, where we humanize science. I'm G.V. Pawan Kumar, your host, and today we are going to discuss something which is at the interface of science, compassion, and rationality. Generally, when one is talking about compassion and rationality, they are not discussed in the one go. But there is a very strong case for bringing rationality and compassion on the same platform, and science probably is one of the best ways to do that. It is not only beneficial to bring in a human component of doing better science, but also in the overall development of the way thought process evolves. Having compassion considered in the scientific domain is equally important. So when we look at the concept of rationality itself, we first need to ask what exactly is rationality, right? So the Oxford Dictionary quotes the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. So stop quote. So the crucial element here is reason or logic, which also means that any thought process we have is based on the consideration of specific kind of evidence. So therefore, any kind of judgment one is making is based on the evidence at hand. And this particular judgment is purely based on the evidence at hand. And this is a crucial factor, because if you now have a new evidence and that particular evidence is in contrast to the older evidence, then you will have to revise your thought. And the basis on which rationality is kind of considered is on the fact that you would be able to change your thoughts as you come across new evidence. And this is a very important thought process because it also gives you a revisionist viewpoint of the way things are in the context of the history of ideas. And therefore, rationality plays a very crucial role in science and technology, and to a large extent, any kind of human intellectual endeavor. So if you ask what is the history behind rationality, well, it goes back all the way to the time when human beings started thinking, when they started making decisions. Rationality in that sense is universal. It doesn't really discriminate among any specific kind of ethnicity, race, or language, or any kind of form of a human being, except for the fact that the human beings actually have to have a kind of a thought process, and that is all rationality really needs. So if you really look back at ancient times, various different kind of civilizations have thought about rationality, have discussed about rationality, and there is a very interesting kind of viewpoints from various different civilizations on rationality itself. So for example, Indian civilization, Greek civilization, Islamic world, all these civilizations actually had very deep roots in understanding the natural world through the lens of rationality and questioning. So for example, if you take the ancient Indian civilization, one of the things which you will come across is something called as Tarka Shastra. So the general definition, for example, if you look at Wikipedia, the word Tarka Shastra is essentially originating from Sanskrit, and it represents the philosophy of dialects, logic and reasoning, and art of debate that analyzes the nature and source of knowledge and its validity. Stop quote. This is very important. You see, the emphasis is on the nature and source of knowledge and its validity. So Tarka is a very important part of the way people thought through specific kind of issues, and it is through debates and logical arguments that a lot of thought process evolved in various different civilizations, including ancient Indian civilizations. Now, if you want to really learn more about it, one of the best books to really understand the evolution of ideas itself is a book which is titled as Ideas, A History of Thought and Invention from Fire to Freud. This is by Peter Watson. This is a 800 odd page masterpiece, and you'll really enjoy learning a lot of interesting things from this particular book. It gives you really the evolution of ideas, how the history of thought and invention kind of evolved. It gives you a tremendous number of references which are very important for one to go explore in detail and dive deep into various different concepts one is interested in. That is one book I strongly recommend, Peter Watson's Ideas. The other book, which is also titled as Rationality, is a recent book by Steven Pinker, who is a very celebrated cognitive psychologist from Harvard University. And his book is slightly more technical, but it gives a very nice viewpoint of how to look at rationality from a framework of understanding the natural world and also understanding the human behavior. For example, he talks a lot about statistical reasoning as one of the important foundations on which rationality is based on, and how human beings can develop this thought process of being rational. Although I should mention that Pinker's work is very interesting, but also sometimes highly debated. But in this particular book, the rationality aspect of looking at things from a statistical viewpoint is something I found very interesting and very kind of profound, so to speak, because the kind of examples he gives and also the kinds of logical fallacies he discusses is really worth exploring and learning from. Anyway, I would be giving the references to all these books. I would urge you to have a look at it in greater detail. Now, going further, we can ask, how is rationality important for science, or how can it play an important role within the context of science itself? In science, the idea is to build a body of knowledge which is strongly based on evidence. So as I mentioned, you need to build this body of evidence based on the information what is at your hand, which means that you will be able to revise these kind of thought processes and any kind of decisions what you have based purely on the evidence which is right in front of you. So therefore, science really is in that way a revisionist process, and it is always ready to actually alter its pathway based on the evidence what it has at its disposal. Now, for example, you take the problem of complexity, which is a very crucial problem which has deep implications in understanding ecology and let's say climate change, or for that matter the whole of universe. In that sense, can be looked at as a problem in complexity. From cities to cosmology, all these problems can be looked at in the context of complexity problems. So there, whenever you have some new information, you would have to really alter your viewpoints and also update this particular viewpoint so that you would be able to go into the new realm of understanding. And in that sense, understanding itself actually is built upon the fact that you are revising your thought process as you go along. There's also a lot of interesting aspects related to this kind of thought process across various different disciplines of science. And also, even if you look at the latest developments in artificial intelligence, there are many deep questions related to how thought process itself occurs and how rational decisions are made, and whether those decisions can be emulated by machines. And these are really important and contemporary questions which are still under exploration. So in order to really understand such new developments, including machine learning based approach to robotics and AI based technologies which can interface with humans, the rationality aspect is a point which has to be considered in significant detail. So what are the forms of rationality? One can have rationality embedded at an individual level. In that sense, every human being no matter what their thought process is or what their belief system is, to a large extent is rational. Take, for example, if somebody is driving on a road, if that person is driving on a road in a particular country, more or less that person actually has to really consider the local environment and make decisions according to the local cues, what she or he gets from the local environment. Which means that there is very important decisions made as that person is actually moving across in the local environment, and this is purely based on the rational decision. And please remember that these decisions are made based on the fact that that person is already embedded in that system. So therefore there is already some kind of a learning process which has happened, and therefore that person is able to navigate through that path, so to speak, because of the fact that she or he can make a decision based on the environmental cue. There is another form of rationality which is a collective rationality. And in collective rationality, a specific kind of thought process is evolved based on the fact that there are many different people thinking about a problem. And therefore, the information what is extracted out of that collective thought process is now exposed and also kind of debated in a large number. And that specific debate leads to certain conclusions based on the available evidence. And therefore, there is some kind of a consensus which is built on that particular process. So, for example, if you say that there is a moon which actually is a satellite of Earth, that particular aspect of the moon coupled to Earth can be verified experimentally, and that particular experimental verification can be done with a reasonably high degree of precision, and that conclusion is now applicable to all human beings who are on Earth. So anybody who would want to really make a measurement can do it, but you would also extract a lot of information from somebody else who has already done that experiment. So you draw an important rational conclusion based on the evidence which has been collectively extracted from whatever tools are available at the disposal. So therefore, the individual and the collective rationality plays an important role. But it is important to remember that when one is making a rational decision in science, one will have to have kind of a specific understanding of the assumptions behind the rational decision. So again, going back to the example of moon, if somebody says that I would want to make a vehicle which will go from Earth to moon, then of course what is the thing which is required to do it. But if the argument is on the fact that whether there is a moon or not, unless and until the people who are taking different paths to reach the moon come to a conclusion that there is a moon, they will not be able to really take any rational step, which means that you should assume that there is a moon. Without that assumption, you would not be able to go forward and take further action based on any kind of rational decisions you can make. So therefore, the complexity which the rationality itself brings in the thought process is equally important, and that is something also makes it very fascinating in science and any kind of intellectual activity, so to speak. Now, how does one become rational? Okay, this is something which is very elegantly explained in Steven Pinker's book on rationality. What he also mentions that the majority of the decisions what human beings make is based on the fact that the information is provided from the environment. So when the environment is providing a lot of information, then you will have to consider a statistical way of looking at the data what you are extracting from the environment. This means that you will have to develop some kind of a statistical thinking to understand what really is happening. And this way of thinking is very important, because generally a lot of fallacies and irrationalities can occur because purely of the fact that one cannot appreciate the statistical reasoning behind a particular conclusion. And this is a learnt process. And therefore, not everybody would probably have similar kind of background in understanding a particular concept, especially when it is related to large numbers. For that matter, if you consider, let's say, economics or some other process related to some complex behavior in natural world, if the specific measurement or specific theory is based on statistical analysis, then you would really be able to extract some meaningful information from this. The other important aspect of cultivating a rational way of looking at any process is to look at evidence as an important material in making decision. So therefore, data becomes critical, and all decisions which are mainly based on some kind of evidence will give you some solace in telling that at least you made a decision based on some input which was provided to you. And the third and the most important aspect, which I believe plays a very critical role in rational thinking, is the ability to ask questions. So this is something which is very crucial when we do research. How you frame your questions will actually lead to the answers which you are interested in. Now, this framing of questions itself is probably one of the most important skills one develops as a researcher. And therefore, questioning is central to how one really looks at any kind of challenge or any kind of phenomena or any kind of process in life itself. So therefore, in order to develop rationality, the statistical thinking, evidence-based learning and evidence-based thinking and questioning plays very critical role in developing the mind which is bent towards rationality. Now that we have been discussing about rationality, is that all what is necessary to really have a human life? The answer is no. The human life, of course, if it is rational, would be able to make decisions which are important and many a times critical. But there is also an element in the decision which should be based on compassion. Okay? Compassion is very, very critical in understanding the local environment. In fact, this is where this particular podcast I would want to emphasize that compassion has an important element in making rational decision. So, for example, first and the foremost thing is to ask what is compassion and how does it, for example, differ from the other concept which is called as empathy. So what is the difference between compassion and empathy? This question has been very beautifully addressed by another very famous social scientist in UPenn. His name is Adam Grant, and he's also a prolific author similar to Steven Pinker. And he has a very interesting take on comparison between compassion and empathy. And to quote Adam Grant, compassion is kinder and healthier than empathy. When we feel others' pain, we often get overwhelmed and withdrawn. When we feel concern for their pain, we reach out and help. The point of compassion isn't to share their feelings, which is essentially the empathy. It's to care about their feelings and act on that particular feeling. Stop quote. Now, this is an important aspect of compassion. Compassion goes beyond mere empathy. Empathy is, of course, feeling for somebody else's pain or somebody other's feeling. But compassion really takes that particular feeling and inculcates a thought process in the system and acts on that particular thought. So therefore, compassion is extremely important, and it plays a very critical role in human interaction. Because if one is able to understand the fellow human being, then there is some kind of an appreciation of what the process is and a viewpoint of how that other person is. And one takes this input and forms an important kind of an action-oriented program to address the other person's shortcomings or some kind of a requirement. Therefore, compassion is very, very critical. And one may ask, why do you need to mix rationality with compassion? Now think about it. if you look at some of the greatest minds who are involved in Manhattan Project, which was one of the biggest projects where tremendous amount of brain power was used to build an atomic bomb. Great people like Oppenheimer, Hans Bethe, Feynman, Enrico Fermi, von Neumann, many other people were involved in this. They were undoubtedly some of the greatest physicists to ever have kind of practiced physics and to large extent physics-based technology. But what is interesting is that they were all very rational to a large extent according to the definitions of what we were talking about. But what probably was missing is the compassion of what happened towards the later part. For example, the consequence of atomic bomb, as we know, was very severe on Japanese. And that really had a very kind of drastic effect on the human kind of behavior, not only in terms of individuals, but also on the collectives, all the way to continents and the whole world itself. Now, one may argue that all these people were actually doing it purely as a scientific endeavor. But we must ask whether the kind of scientific concepts that were used without the understanding of the consequence of what could have happened in future. In fact, there are many people, including Hans Bethe, Feynman, and other people, who later on kind of regretted having really created this monster of atomic bomb, which turned out to have a severe consequence on the way the geopolitics of the world actually evolved. It further led to Cold War and various different kind of problems. So therefore, sometimes rationality itself is not enough. It has to be mixed with compassion and also some kind of a consideration for the consequence of what happens to fellow human beings. So this is slightly from a broader context of why science and compassion is necessary. When it also comes to other questions of bringing rationality and compassion together, another important aspect is that such amalgamation is necessary to really make science kind of reachable to everybody. Science is by essence is not kind of an elitist activity. So therefore, if one has to shred that image of a scientist sitting in the ivory tower, then one will have to mix rationality with enough compassion to make science kind of science which is applicable to the common person. Now, what happens when either of this element is missing? That is an important question to ask. So if you have only rationality and no compassion, then generally the person who is practicing science or any kind of rational activity starts condescending, and sometimes the person can be dismissive. And this kind of rationality without compassion is not good for the practice of science. Then it would be exclusive of a large population of people who not only directly benefit from what science and technology has to offer, but also to participate in that particular development. The compassion is very important. The other way around of being compassionate but not having any specific rationality actually is even also disastrous, because you might end up taking wrong decisions. There is no development of knowledge. You may have good intentions, but all the consequences turn out to be wrong. And therefore, rationality is equally important with the compassion what a person has. So, what is the way to combine this rationality and compassion? Is there a specific method we can bring in so that we can amalgamate them together? How can we really make science both rational and compassionate? In fact, there is a lot of debate nowadays which is happening to really, defend science and scientific method. Recently there was also a meeting in Delhi where there was a lot of debate on this, where historians and scientists came together to ask this question of how to define science and scientific method. And there are some very interesting questions asked in that particular discussion. I will also link some YouTube videos on that particular thing. But my own take is to look at the combination of rationality with compassion through the lens of learning. Now, in the process of learning, generally one is kind of really underplaying the ego component of a person, which means that in order to learn something, one will have to make choices and make rational choices in understanding some specific concept. But equally important aspect of learning is, especially if somebody is learning from a source, that particular person who is teaching from that source should be equally compassionate, which means that there is an element of the element of human interaction, which is not just in the realm of rationality but also in terms of the compassion. This also requires understanding something from various different viewpoints, which is probably one of the most important things one can achieve while doing science. As you probably can appreciate, if you ask a specific scientific question, in order to answer that question, you cannot have only one particular viewpoint. So you will have to learn various different ways in which you can address a particular question. Only then you would probably end up getting a complete understanding of something, and this enriches the thought process, and this really brings in various different innovations and some also very creative work out of the scientific pursuit. So in order to really combine rationality with compassion, one should be compassionate enough to really look at both learning and teaching as an important foundation on which this combination can be achieved. And this is something very crucial, especially in the terms of education. There's also a lot of debate on kind of improving mathematical thinking process among children. If you look at the various ways in which countries are now kind of compared and contrasted, one of the crucial factors they ask is how well is a child educated in science and mathematics. Because the capability of a human being to really make rational decisions will be very, very important going in future, because the complexity of the problems will increase. And this is where, again, going back to the concept of tarka, which is essentially the logical reasoning, which is so important part of Indian philosophy, is very crucial. So I will re-emphasize on the fact that rationality is not just a mere concept of Western thought process. It is equally an important and a very relevant thought process within the Indian philosophy. And great thinkers from centuries ago have been really thinking about rational aspects of life, asking questions, debating, and really trying to find answers from various different viewpoints. So therefore, one should not actually keep the realm of rationality as something foreign to Indian kind of context. Rationality is, as I mentioned, is a universal phenomena where human beings are really making some specific decision. So therefore, rationality is important. But what I am making a case here is to bring in rationality with compassion, so that this combination can really make not only for good science, but also makes a strong case for a coherent and a cohesive viewpoint of the way human beings actually can function on the planet Earth. The collective knowledge is very important for human species, you see, because the biggest challenges which we face nowadays is climate change and various different processes of how human beings can handle economics, and how one actually can have various different natural resources preserved and also conserve, and to a large extent also how one can enhance the diversity on Earth. And these are all complex problems which requires both compassion and rational choices to make going in future. So I would be giving all the references I have used to kind of make this podcast. I would strongly urge you to have a look at some of the references. The podcast is just a kind of a window. If you really want to dive deep and understand things, I would still value going to the references, learning from the original resources, and making your own choices, both in terms of rational and compassionate aspect of looking at a problem, because that is very crucial to have a good, peaceful, and thoughtful human life. Thank you. Bye bye.